Hey, Star Trek fans. My name is Don Hillenbrand, and me and my buddy Jim Kirk here, where we've got an amazing Star Trek story that has been 58 years in the making. You know, like millions of you out there, I'm a Star Trek fan. But I'm also a collector and researcher of original production-made props and costumes from the original Star Trek series and the corresponding movies like Wrath of Khan and The Voyage Home. Now, because I'm a collector of early Star Trek pieces, I've done a ton of research and have written extensively about these things on my blog for about 15 years now. Due to this fact, I get contacted pretty frequently by auction houses and individuals with questions about various Star Trek items, and that's how this story begins, with a simple email where the sender tells me he has a couple of original series props and asks me if I might look at them. He said they were obtained by a now deceased relative who worked in the LA prop scene back in the day. Now, honestly, my initial reaction was not one of excitement because, frankly, been there, done that. People think that they have something when in fact they don't. Nevertheless, I always take a look and tell them whatever I can, so I checked out his pics. Now, it usually takes me about 60 seconds or so to determine what's going on with a thing, but in this case, that first minute didn't tell me anything concrete. I found I was confused momentarily because my default is always, this isn't real, because it's never real. And that's because there are so many replicas out there that people try to pass as real. So it took a minute for the realization to sink in that maybe, just maybe, I was looking at a very unusual thing because maybe I was looking at authentic pieces, two authentic pieces, a phaser and a communicator. Needless to say, I carefully dove in. I have an extensive archive of information from every known phaser and communicator from the original series, and I spent the next several hours dissecting the images I was sent. Now let me interject something here that I think is very important. My goal with these things is to always follow the evidence. That means I have to be brutally objective. No cherry picking of facts that fit a particular narrative. I'm not hoping that something is either real or fake. It is essential to keep an open mind while also being hypercritical. It's only with that mindset that you can arrive at the truth. So as I was tearing apart these images, I was being incredibly circumspect. I'm looking for flaws. I'm looking for reasons to doubt. I'm looking for errors, because there's always errors. But in this case, every passing second made my doubt slowly vanish. And this brings me to a second very important thing. Please keep in mind that anything can be faked. And I mean anything. Da Vinci paintings, Marilyn Monroe dresses, Luke Skywalker's lightsaber, and yes, Star Trek props. All can and have been faked in the past. It's because of this that it's irresponsible to authenticate anything without an extensive hands-on examination. And so that's what I told the owner. I told him that while I thought he had two wonderful pieces, for an actual authentication to happen, it needed to be in person. And they completely understood. So, flash forward, and eventually the owners decided to go to auction with Julien's auction house. As I had a prior relationship with Julien's, they asked me to come in and do the hands-on authentication. Now, I have literally handled hundreds of Star Trek items over time. But there has never been anything that I had a higher sense of anticipation about like these pieces. And they did not disappoint. A hands-on examination tells you things that photos simply can't. Things like paint, or the nature of the crispness of a thing, or how it's assembled, or the weight of it, or a thousand other little things. And at this point, you can also literally take the piece apart and get into the nuts and bolts of the thing. You can examine the hidden recesses in a way not possible with mere pictures. And while I always knew the Phaser was a hero version, the communicator did not appear to be, because the telltale element of a stopwatch to power the dial movement was simply missing in the original photos. All we see is waxy hot glue or something. But then we opened it up, and incredibly, we found that the stopwatch was indeed there, but it had been turned over at some point in the past, and it put in upside down. So that and a hole in the shell that permitted the winding mechanism told us that, incredibly, this is one of only 2 hero communicators ever made for the original show. The movement inside the dial was only seen in 2 episodes, and only once super clearly. And this matched. For the Phaser, we opened it up and were greeted with all the incredible detail mechanisms that would be necessary in a real piece. And critically, when all of those pieces were compared to another recently sold hero Phaser, the Greg Jean hero, everything was a match. Not just, it's kind of close, or it's sort of a kind of thing. No. Exact. So it was this hands-on analysis that permitted us to definitively conclude that not only were these pieces real, but that they could be screen matched to specific scenes in original Star Trek episodes, which is incredibly unlikely. But because of the original film was rescanned in high res for the Blu-ray release of Star Trek, we could now see small details and defects like solder on the communicator antenna, or nicks and dents and tiny imperfections that were found on the Phaser that were unique matches to what was seen on screen. Think of it as a fingerprint. No 2 are the same. So now let's talk about what makes these 2 things so incredible. Not just regular props. That is the fact that they are hero props. What that means is that they were routinely used by Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, and they were specifically created for use in close-ups. They had far more details, including actual moving parts, unlike other versions that were basically just static pieces. The Phaser specifically can be identified in several episodes, including the Cloudminders, Court Martial, the Gamesters of Triskelion, and in the closing credits of a piece of the action. The communicator can clearly be seen in the classic Cat's Paw and Friday's Child, and most notably in Kirk's hands in Day of the Dove, where we can see the spinning detail in one of the few moments it's ever shown in the entire 3-year run. These key uses define these as Kirk's hero Phaser and communicator. Now that's an astonishing thing that cannot be said definitively of any other known versions of these props. It's incredible. But there's yet another amazing connection with this Phaser. Back in 1968, a book was published called The Making of Star Trek. It was the first ever book about Star Trek, and it featured behind-the-scenes information and photos that could not be found anywhere else. And look at that. Lots of shots of props. Here's the tricorder and the communicator. It has every prop basically that they ever used, and specific. And by the way, this is my original copy. Here's the Phasers, and look at that Phaser right there. That one right there. Yeah, that Phaser, that specific Phaser, is the one that matches ours. On that, but it's a conclusive proof that it matches. So, as astonishing as these 2 things were, though, they were not without problems. As you can see from the original images, the communicator was missing key interior details, most notably the center bezel or dial, along with its spinning detail. The Phaser, while far more complete, was missing 2 small parts: a clear plastic half moon that attaches to the Phaser 1 meter at the top, as well as a brass plate on the base of the Phaser 2 handle. To address these issues, it was determined that the communicator would undergo full restoration using many of the original parts used in the original builds, including a working vintage stopwatch which would return it to its original working condition. As for the Phaser, the 2 small parts would be fabricated to complete it. Now, even with these problems, I felt strongly that they could be restored to a beautiful condition if we got the right person. And boy, was I right. The pieces were restored by a well-known Star Trek prop guy named John Long, who through his acquaintance with the legendary Greg Jean has probably handled as many original series props as anyone alive. So because of that unique skill set, we brought him on, and he's done an amazing job. And I'll be talking more about that in the future. Now, I want you to know, with all that has been said here, that I absolutely understand how many of you are going to be skeptical. And you know what? I don't blame you. But know this. I'm a firm believer in the notion that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I'll be sharing every bit of that evidence with you going forward. So don't take my word for it. Wade into the pieces, and I think the more you look, the more you'll be convinced for yourself. Now, we collectors have a saying: the piece has to speak for itself. And there has never been two pieces that spoke more clearly, more specifically, or more beautifully for themselves than these two amazing pieces. So there you have it. Two pieces of literal Star Trek history that have been hidden away in a box for close to half a century and have finally been shown in the light of day. Two of the most recognizable props ever created for the original Star Trek series. You know, it was an honor to actually be able to experience these pieces firsthand. It was as close to a religious experience as I'm ever going to get. And more than that, first and foremost, I'm a lifelong Star Trek fan. And so for a few brief moments, as I held these treasures in my hands, my heart soared. I was transported back in time. I was 12 years old, and I was using the phaser to hold off the Gorn on Cestus 3, and I used the communicator to call up to Scotty and tell him to beam me up. You know, to borrow from the motion picture, for a brief moment, I touched the Creator. I'm tearing up. These amazing objects have held my imagination for 50 years, and I'll bet you so many of you have that same thing. And it's wonderful to know that in an upcoming Julien's auction in November, they will be out in the world in perpetuity. And between now and then, I'll be sharing more specifics about these items, as well as other incredible stuff that will be part of that auction. So with that, what else can I say but live long and prosper. Thanks for watching. Oh, yeah, I'm one of those guys that can never do this. Forget it. Thanks. Oh, hey, when you're done with the video, make sure to check out my blog. Link is below. You'll get tons more information and images about everything we speak of. All right?